She was sitting alone on a park bench, hungry and ignored, until a poor mechanic handed her a sandwich and unknowingly changed both their lives forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind rolled softly through the bare trees, whispering secrets to the fallen leaves. It was one of those early spring afternoons that still felt like winter, clinging on for dear life. Caleb Reed sat on the far bench at Lincoln Park, unwrapping the sandwich he'd packed that morning. 2 slices of bread, a little peanut butter, and just enough jelly to taste it. Nothing fancy. But it filled the silence between engine repairs and the next overdue bill. He had grease on his hands, dirt under his nails, and the kind of tired eyes that came from working too many hours and sleeping too few. This was his spot. No one bothered him here. It was just him, the birds, and whatever lunch he'd managed to throw together. That's when he noticed her. She sat on the bench across the walkway, hunched into her coat, like she was trying to disappear inside it. Her hair was tied back, but strands had slipped free, brushing her cheeks with the breeze. She looked out of place, like someone who had taken a wrong turn out of a magazine and ended up in the wrong part of the world. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't scrolling or talking or pretending to look busy. She was just sitting. Still, like she didn't know what else to do. Caleb didn't think. He just stood, walked over, and held out half of his sandwich. "It's not much, but it's fresh." The woman blinked up at him, clearly caught off guard. I'm fine." "Maybe," he said, voice quiet, "but you look cold and hungry." She hesitated. Then, with the kind of hesitation that said she wasn't used to accepting things she didn't pay for, she reached out and took it. Their fingers didn't touch, but something else did, a kind of human recognition. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than the wind. Caleb offered a half smile. "Any time." Then he returned to his bench, unwrapped the second half of his sandwich, and took a bite. Neither of them spoke again, but somehow the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. She sat with the sandwich in her lap like it was something precious, not just food, but something gentler, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The wrapper crinkled softly as she peeled it back, her fingers stiff and slow from the cold. She took a small bite, more careful than hungry, and chewed like the flavor itself surprised her. It wasn't the taste. It was the warmth behind it. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands. The hoodie she wore was oversized, likely borrowed, maybe even stolen from the back of a hotel gym, but underneath, just barely visible when the wind shifted the folds of her coat, was a flash of fabric far too fine for a town like this. Silk, ivory white. The kind worn under a tailored blazer, not on a park bench near a mechanic's lunch break. Her coat was designer, if you knew what to look for. The threading on the cuffs, the stitching on the shoulders. But it was torn at the seam beneath one arm, the kind of damage that doesn't happen to people with drivers or assistants. It happens when someone runs. She didn't check her phone, didn't glance around like someone waiting to be found. If anything, she seemed like she hoped the world would forget she was there at all. Her face held the kind of stillness that wasn't calm, but fragile. Eyes focused on the horizon while her mind wandered somewhere far from Lincoln Park. The city, maybe, or farther. Maybe to a place where she wasn't measured in press releases and board meetings. Maybe a time when she still remembered what it felt like to be seen without being evaluated. She glanced at the man again. He was back on his bench, finishing the other half of the sandwich like nothing strange had happened. No questions, no demands, just kindness offered with calloused hands. She took another bite, slower this time. The wind stung less. The park felt a little less foreign, and for the first time since she'd walked away from everything she'd ever built, she didn't feel like running. The sandwich was nearly gone when he spoke again, not loud, not intrusive, just enough to be heard over the wind as it rustled the brittle branches above them. "Crazy how the wind knows exactly when to sneak past your coat," Caleb said, rubbing his palms together. She looked up, unsure if he was actually talking to her, But he wasn't looking for attention, just sharing the kind of thought people don't say when they expect a response. She gave a soft nod. It's sharper here. The wind, I mean. In the city, it mostly gets blocked by buildings. Here, it just bites. He chuckled. Yeah, small-town perks. She turned slightly, pulling her hoodie closer around her face. Is it always this quiet? Mostly, he replied. Except when the high school wins a game or Mrs. Caldwell's cat goes missing again. A small laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. It caught both of them off guard. That bad, huh? He asked, half grinning. She puts up posters, she said, for a cat that hides in her own attic. Caleb nodded solemnly. Last time she offered a $20 reward. Said no questions asked, like we were harboring the thing. Another laugh, this one fuller, the kind that warmed her chest as much as the sandwich had. She hadn't laughed in weeks, not like that. Not where it wasn't calculated or polite or buffered by context. He leaned back on the bench, eyes closed against the sun that filtered through the gray. Funny what makes a town feel like home. Sometimes it's the dumb stuff. She was quiet, then said, I wouldn't know. He turned toward her slightly, eyes open now, but didn't press. She appreciated that. Most people either demanded her story or assumed it based on headlines. He just let her be someone without a past for a moment. Peanut butter and jelly, she said quietly, holding up the last bite. Haven't had it in years. Thought I outgrew it. You don't outgrow the good stuff, he said. And for once she believed someone, not because he had credentials, not because he had power, but because he sounded like someone who meant it. They lingered longer than either of them expected. The wind had calmed some, the kind of pause that made it easier to pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, brushing crumbs from his jeans. She was still holding the sandwich wrapper, folded neatly in her lap like a secret she didn't want to throw away. So, he said casually, not turning toward her, do I at least get a name to go with the sandwich? There was a flicker behind her eyes, not panic, just the brief hesitation of someone who'd been trained to measure every word before speaking it. For a split second, she considered giving him the whole truth, the name that commanded rooms, the name that came with stock tickers and press scrutiny and bodyguards at every corner. But not here, not now. Lena, she said finally, just Lena. He glanced over, smiling. Lena, that fits. Simple, but strong. She smiled back faintly. And you? Caleb, he said, wiping his hands on a napkin that looked like it had survived one too many glove compartments. Caleb Reed, local mechanic, part-time diner cook, and professional sandwich donor. Nice to meet you, Caleb, she said, meaning it more than he'd know. She didn't tell him the rest, that her full name, Malene Sinclair, was printed on the corner of more luxury car brochures than she could count, that her initials were stamped onto chrome plates inside every vehicle her company produced, that just yesterday people were still calling her ma'am in rooms where she paid everyone's salary. Today, none of that mattered. Today, she was just a tired woman on a bench in a town where no one recognized her. And this man, this kind, worn, utterly ordinary man, had looked at her like she was human, not valuable, not dangerous, just cold and hungry and worthy of sharing a sandwich. Thanks again, she said, eyes meeting his, for the food, for not asking too many questions. Caleb shrugged. Some people talk when they're ready. Until then, silence works just fine. And she nodded, because right now, silence did feel fine, peaceful even. Like maybe for the first time in too long she could just be Lena. They sat in that easy, comfortable quiet a little while longer, not because they didn't have things to say, but because neither of them felt the need to fill the space. That kind of silence was rare in Lena's world. In boardrooms, people filled the air with words to prove their worth. In her penthouse, silence meant isolation. But here, with Caleb and the faint sounds of kids laughing in the distance, it felt like breathing room. Eventually, she stood brushing imaginary dust off her jeans. Caleb followed suit, stretching his arms like someone used to working with his body, not talking with his mouth. "Well," he said, picking up the empty paper bag, "if you're ever in need of more gourmet peanut butter sandwiches, you know where to find me." She smiled softly. "Is that right?" He nodded toward the street behind the park. "Garage is just 2 blocks over. Reed's Auto, red door. Can't miss it." "Garage coffee any good?" she asked, teasing lightly. He grinned. "Depends who you ask. My niece says it tastes like burnt toast, but she drinks hot cocoa with marshmallows, so what does she know?" Lena laughed, and it came out easier this time, less restrained. "And you? What do you think?" "I think it's real," he said with a shrug. "No frothy nonsense, no caramel drizzle, just hot, strong, and waiting on whoever walks in cold." She tucked her hands into her hoodie and looked down for a second, then up again. "That actually sounds perfect." He didn't ask where she was staying. He didn't ask why she looked like she hadn't slept. He didn't mention the tear in her coat or the way she flinched slightly every time a siren passed in the distance. He didn't need to. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who dug for stories. He was the kind who gave space for them to be told. "If you ever need a place to warm up," he said gently, "you're welcome. No expectations, just heat, coffee, and maybe a dog-eared magazine or two." And as she nodded and turned to leave, she realized something unexpected. She might just take him up on that. The next morning came with a sky the color of dishwater and a wind that stung the cheeks before a person even made it halfway down the block. Lena pulled her borrowed hoodie tighter, the sleeves swallowing her hands, and walked with no destination until her feet took her where her mind had already decided to go. The red door of Reed's Auto wasn't flashy. The paint was chipped at the bottom, the bell above the door rusted and slightly crooked. But when she pushed it open, warmth spilled out like a welcome, carrying the smell of motor oil, brewed coffee, and something else, something like comfort. It shouldn't have felt like anything. She had walked through marble lobbies and into penthouses with fireplaces bigger than this entire building. She had her name etched on chrome and stitched into leather seats. But none of it smelled like this. None of it made her shoulders relax the way this old garage did. Caleb looked up from under the hood of a pickup, the engine groaning softly as if agreeing with the day's chill. He didn't look surprised to see her. He just gave her a nod like he'd been expecting her all along. "Coffee's on the workbench," he said, voice muffled by the wrench clutched between his teeth. She followed the scent to a cracked old thermos and 2 mismatched mugs. One read, "Best Uncle Ever." The other had grease stains that wouldn't wash off even if she tried. She poured herself a cup, the liquid dark and steaming. One sip in, and she coughed. "You weren't kidding about strong," she muttered. Caleb chuckled from under the hood. "It doubles as engine cleaner in a pinch." She smiled behind the rim of the mug and found a seat on an old stool by the wall. It wobbled slightly, but she didn't mind. Everything here was a little rough around the edges, but it all had a purpose, a place, a reason to exist. She looked around at the tools, the half-torn posters, the calendar 2 months behind, and thought to herself, this place shouldn't feel like home, and yet somehow it already did. The bell above the red door jingled twice before the little whirlwind came barreling in. Boots too big for her feet, a pink knit hat with a crooked pom-pom, and cheeks flushed from the cold, Emily made her grand entrance like she owned the place. Caleb looked up from his workbench and grinned. "Emily," he said, setting down a socket wrench, "aren't you supposed to be in school?" "Aunt Lisa's got the flu. School said come back tomorrow, so I'm helping today." She tossed her backpack into the corner with the confidence of someone twice her size and turned, stopping short when she saw Lena sitting quietly on the old stool near the coffee thermos. Lena offered a small wave, unsure of how much to say. Emily stared, not rudely, just openly, like only kids can, eyes wide, lips parted in curious awe. "You're really pretty," she said finally, walking closer. "Like, really?" Are you a fairy? Lena blinked. A what? A fairy, Emily repeated, matter of fact. Like from the books. You don't look like you're from around here, and your hair's too shiny. That's usually a giveaway. Caleb stifled a laugh and turned away, busying himself with a tire he clearly didn't need to adjust. Lena leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Well, I'm not from around here. That part's true. Emily stepped closer, examining her like she was inspecting a butterfly. Do you have wings? Lena smiled. Only on the inside. That seemed to satisfy the girl, who nodded wisely and plopped down on the floor beside her like they were already old friends. Fair enough. I always thought fairies were just people who show up when things are broken, like stories or hearts or, I don't know, breaks. Lena glanced toward Caleb, who was watching them from the corner of his eye, pretending not to be listening. Sometimes, Lena said softly, people just show up when they need to be reminded they're still human. Emily tilted her head. Is that what Uncle Caleb is doing for you? Lena paused, then smiled. Something like that. And somehow, that tiny exchange felt like one of the most honest conversations she'd had in years. The motel was the kind of place with scratchy sheets and a heater that groaned louder than it warmed. The wallpaper peeled in the corners and the television only played 3 channels, one of which was permanently stuck on weather. But the door locked, the lights worked, and for the first time in weeks, no one knew where she was. Lena sat on the edge of the bed, one leg curled beneath her, her phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand like a mosquito that wouldn't die. She didn't look at it right away. She didn't have to. She knew what she'd find. Names she recognized, numbers she didn't. Voicemails stacked up like warning signs. Malene, this is Thomas. The board is growing concerned. Where the hell are you? You missed the product launch. You can't just disappear. You're the face of the brand. Call me back. Now. And then the messages shifted. Not colder, but more desperate. Just let us know you're okay. The media's picked up on your absence. There are rumors. Are they true? She turned the screen face down. The words CEO missing flashed in a notification preview beneath a headline banner. Stock tickers, breaking news, talk show speculation. It wasn't about her, not the person sitting on a lumpy bed in yesterday's clothes. It was about the image, the icon, the brand. And she was tired of all of it. The real Malene Sinclair hadn't disappeared last week. She'd been fading for years. Every time she had to pretend, perform, negotiate her way into being respected. Every time her kindness was mistaken for weakness. Every time she gave away pieces of herself to stay in charge of something that never let her rest. Now she silenced the calls, one after another, until the only sound left was the hum of the ancient heater and the faint buzz of streetlights outside the window. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat still in the quiet breathing. She wasn't ready to go back. She didn't know if she ever would be, because for the first time in years, she wasn't being watched. She was simply being. The next morning, the sky threatened rain, thick clouds rolling low across the rooftops like a warning whispered in gray. Lena showed up at the garage anyway, her hair tucked under a beanie, her coat zipped high. Caleb was already outside, locking up for his lunch shift, wiping grease from his hands with a towel that looked like it had been bleached by both sun and time. "Too early for engine talk?" she asked. He looked up, smiled. "Nah, just heading out to flip pancakes and charm old ladies." She raised an eyebrow. "That so?" He held the door open. "You hungry?" She hesitated. She hadn't eaten anything decent since the sandwich. She wasn't sure she remembered what a quiet meal without expectations felt like. "Sure," she said, tucking her hands into her pockets. The diner sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, with a flickering sign that read Millie's Home Cookin' in faded red cursive. Inside, the air smelled like bacon grease, syrup, and stories that had been told too many times to ever stop being funny. Caleb slid behind the counter with the ease of someone who belonged there. He grabbed an apron, tied it around his waist, and called out a few greetings like he'd been born in that kitchen. The cook nodded at Lena without asking who she was. A waitress poured her coffee and said, "Muffin or toast, sugar," like they'd known each other since preschool. Lena chose a booth in the corner and watched. Caleb moved like a man who didn't need applause. He flipped pancakes with one hand, handed off coffee refills with the other, and threw a joke over his shoulder to a table of truckers who laughed so hard they almost knocked over the syrup. There was no script, no pretense, just a man doing a job, one plate at a time, making everyone around him feel like the day might actually be okay. And no one looked at her twice. No cameras, no whispers, no expectations, just another face in a diner filled with small-town rhythm and worn in kindness. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Lena wasn't someone important. She was just welcome. The lunch rush came and went like a passing summer storm, quick, noisy, and full of crumbs. Caleb moved behind the counter with practiced ease, his sleeves rolled to his elbows and his hair just messy enough to suggest he'd been fighting with a spatula or a particularly stubborn plate of hash browns. Lena stayed in the corner booth, sipping her third cup of coffee. She didn't even like coffee this bitter, but it was warm, and it gave her something to hold. The booth cushion squeaked every time she shifted. The window beside her fogged from the heat inside and the damp outside. It all felt a little unreal, like watching someone else's life from the inside of a postcard. Then it happened. Caleb was mid-joke, halfway through pouring syrup onto a stack of pancakes for a man with a cowboy hat and a laugh like thunder. The bottle, slightly cracked near the spout, sputtered, and a glob of syrup slid straight down Caleb's apron. He stepped back, trying to catch it, and the edge of the apron snagged on the dispenser's handle. "What the—" he muttered, tugging at the fabric. The syrup bottle tilted. The sticky spiral of chaos continued. Caleb twisted, but the more he moved, the more the apron tangled, until he gave it one last frustrated yank, and the entire bottle of syrup exploded onto his boot. Lena choked. It started as a stifled sound behind her hand, but when Caleb looked up, wide-eyed and frozen, with syrup dripping from his apron like some kind of breakfast battlefield injury, she couldn't stop it. She laughed. Not a polite chuckle. Not the kind of calculated smile reserved for interviews or scripted charm. A real laugh. Sudden, involuntary, loud. Her head tilted back, and she covered her mouth, but it didn't help. It burst out of her like sunlight through a window she didn't know had been closed. Caleb looked at her, then at his boot, then back again, and grinned. "Well," he said, lifting the bottle like a trophy, "at least now my right foot smells delicious." She laughed harder, and in that simple, ridiculous moment, something in her loosened, something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Joy, unforced, unscripted, real. The rain came without warning, one of those relentless, drumming storms that felt like it had been holding back all week, waiting for the perfect night to let loose. The streets of Maplewood glistened under the flickering street lamps, rivers of water rushing down curbs, soaking anything that dared to stand still. Caleb was just locking up the garage for the night, the scent of oil and steel still clinging to his skin. He was halfway through flipping the switch to kill the lights when he heard the sound, a sharp knock against the glass door, hesitant but urgent. He turned. There she was, Lena, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face, hoodie clinging to her like a second skin. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but something quieter. He couldn't name it right away. All he knew was that it wasn't good. He opened the door without a word. Rain spilled in behind her as she stepped inside, her shoes squishing softly against the concrete floor. "I can't go back," she said, voice low and broken around the edges. "Not yet." That was all. She didn't explain what happened. She didn't need to. Caleb saw it in the way her shoulders hunched inward, in the way her arms wrapped tight around herself like she was trying to hold her own pieces together. He didn't ask questions. He walked to the break room, grabbed the thickest blanket off the back of the old couch, the one Emily called the burrito blanket, and draped it over Lena's shoulders without speaking. The fabric smelled faintly of coffee and dryer sheets, and it swallowed her whole. She sank onto the couch, rain still dripping from her sleeves, and clutched the blanket like it was the only thing anchoring her to the room. Caleb sat nearby, close enough to be there, far enough not to crowd her. He sipped from a leftover mug of cold coffee and stared at the wall like they were just two people ending a long day. The storm outside howled, the lights buzzed softly overhead, and in the quiet warmth of the garage, Lena didn't say another word, but for the first time that night, she didn't feel alone. The storm had quieted, but the power hadn't returned. The garage sat wrapped in soft darkness, the occasional rumble of thunder now distant, like an old engine winding down. Caleb lit a single candle from the emergency drawer, short, squat, the kind that came in a pack of 10 at the dollar store. It cast a warm glow across the break room, flickering against the shelves of spare parts and the dented metal fridge. Lena sat curled under the burrito blanket, hair finally drying in gentle waves, eyes fixed on the small flame. Caleb handed her a chipped mug filled with something hot. Tea maybe, though she didn't ask. He didn't speak, just sat across from her, elbows on his knees, letting the silence open a door. It was Lena who stepped through it. "My name's not just Lena," she said, voice quiet but steady. "It's Malene Sinclair." Caleb blinked, but didn't flinch. She took a breath like she'd been underwater for years and finally surfaced. "CEO of Sinclair Automotive, one of the youngest female executives in the country. My face is on magazine covers and conference stages. I've shaken hands with senators and sold cars to royalty." She looked up at him, and none of it feels real anymore. Caleb didn't speak. He let her go on. "They all want something," she said. "My board, my staff, my so-called friends. I was raised to be brilliant, polished, untouchable, and I played the part. Perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect answers. But I was always just tired, always trying to stay one step ahead of being replaced." Her fingers gripped the mug tighter. "I left without telling anyone, just walked out after a shareholders meeting, got in a car, drove until the road felt unfamiliar, ended up here, on that bench, with a stranger who offered me half a sandwich." Her eyes met his, brave, vulnerable, a little defiant. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to be Malene Sinclair. I wanted to be someone who wasn't constantly being evaluated, someone who could laugh at syrup stains and feel safe under a cheap blanket in a greasy garage." Caleb sat back, let the truth settle between them. Then, with the gentlest smile, he said, "Well, Lena, that's who I've been talking to this whole time." And for the first time in years, she believed someone really saw her. The candle flickered low, its wax pooling along the chipped saucer beneath it. Outside, the wind had quieted to a soft hush, brushing against the garage walls like a lullaby. Inside, the silence was different now, not heavy, not awkward, just still, like something sacred had been laid bare, and neither of them wanted to be the first to move. Caleb leaned back in his chair, mug cradled between his hands, eyes steady on her. He didn't look shocked. He didn't recoil at the weight of her name. If anything, he looked thoughtful, like he was fitting the truth into what he already knew, and nothing important had changed. Lena sat across from him, shoulders drawn up beneath the blanket, waiting for the part where he looked at her differently, where the tone shifted and the room suddenly felt colder. That's what usually happened when people found out who she was. They started calculating, measuring, wanting. But Caleb just sipped his tea. Then he gave her a half smile, soft at the edges, like he'd been holding it until the right moment. "Well," he said, setting his mug down with a quiet clink, "I still think you owe me half a sandwich." Lena blinked. A beat passed, and then she laughed. Really laughed. Not because it was clever, not because it was rehearsed, but because it was perfect, uncomplicated, the one response that didn't twist her confession into something heavy. "That's it?" she asked, wiping the corner of her eye. "No questions about the company? No lectures about responsibility or how the world's watching. Caleb shrugged, leaning forward. I figure if you wanted more questions, you wouldn't have ended up in a garage with a guy who still fixes things with duct tape. She looked at him like she was seeing him all over again. This man with grease on his sleeves and honesty in his eyes. No agenda, no performance, just Caleb. And in that tiny garage with a candle between them and the storm finally behind her, Lena felt something rare and disarming settle in her chest. Trust. In a town like Maplewood, secrets didn't stay secret for long. Not because people were cruel, but because curiosity had nowhere else to go. News spread the same way syrup slid off a stack of pancakes at Millie's diner. Slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. It started with a glance. Then a comment, then a look passed across a table between two old men who hadn't spoken much since the church roof fundraiser back in '09. Have you seen the girl? One asked, stirring his coffee. The one with the boots? The other replied. Yeah, too clean for here. Looks like she walked out of a city magazine and into the wrong zip code. Whispers turned into conversations. Lena didn't try to stand out, but that was the thing. Her not trying only made her more noticeable. She wore jeans now, sometimes borrowed from Caleb's emergency stash of mismatched laundry in the back of the garage, but the way she moved still carried grace. Her boots, scuffed as they were now, weren't from any store in town. Her eyes, too sharp and too tired, looked like they'd seen too many deals go wrong, too many cameras flash before she was ready. People saw her sipping coffee from the garage's chipped mugs, standing close to Caleb near the open bay, or laughing in the corner booth at Millie's like she had nowhere else to be. And that was the strangest part, because people like her always had somewhere else to be. They started calling her Garage Girl. Wonder who she is. Maybe a cousin. Maybe a big city reporter doing a story on small-town life. I heard she was hiding out after a bad breakup. No, she's scouting locations for a movie. That garage is too photogenic for real life. Caleb didn't offer explanations, and Lena didn't correct anyone. Let them guess, let them wonder, because for the first time in her life, being unknown felt like freedom. And in a town full of whispers, she found peace in being the only truth no one could quite pin down. The day started with sunlight pouring through the wide garage doors, casting warm beams across the concrete floor. The kind of morning that made even worn-down tools look a little golden. Caleb was halfway through rotating tires on Mrs. Hampton's old station wagon when he heard the familiar creak of the front door. Lena stepped in, her hoodie swapped for a simple flannel, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She looked around, then down at her own hands, now free of rings, polish, or any trace of the woman who used to sign deals with a Mont Blanc pen. Teach me something, she said. Caleb glanced up from behind the tire iron. Teach you what? How to help. How to fix something. She smiled, half nervous, half determined. Unless there's a certification process I don't know about. He wiped his hands and stood. Well, I do have a very strict tire-changing exam. Involves grease, elbow pain, and cursing. She raised an eyebrow. I'm fluent in at least 2 of those. He tossed her a pair of gloves. She didn't flinch when they landed in her hands, didn't hesitate to put them on, even though they were stained and didn't fit quite right. He grabbed a lug wrench from the tool cart and walked her through the process. How to loosen the bolts before raising the jack. How to angle her body weight just enough. How to feel the give in the metal when it starts cooperating. Her movements were stiff at first, unsure, but she listened, paid attention. When the wrench finally groaned loose on her first try, she grinned like a kid who'd just ridden a bike without training wheels. By the time they had the tire off and the spare on, her gloves were dusty, her ponytail had fallen loose, and a smear of grease had appeared on her cheek without her noticing. Caleb didn't mention it. He just handed her a rag and said, "Not bad." She wiped her forehead with the back of her glove, leaving a darker streak, and looked down at her stained fingers. No polish, no shine, just grit and proof. "I've signed billion-dollar contracts," she said softly. But this feels like the first thing I've done that actually mattered." Caleb smiled. "Welcome to the club." The garage was quiet after hours. Its heartbeat slowed to a hum of resting tools and the occasional creak of cooling metal. The night air carried a crispness that hinted at early autumn, and above them the stars had come out in full, sharp, brilliant, and endless. Caleb climbed the rusted side ladder with 2 cold sodas in hand, balancing them like glass trophies. Lena followed behind, careful on the metal rungs, but smiling when she reached the top. The rooftop wasn't pretty, patched tar, a few screws sticking up in the corners, an old lawn chair that had lost one arm, but it had a view, and for Caleb, that was enough. They lay side by side on an old moving blanket he kept stashed under the AC unit. Lena folded her arms behind her head, her hair splayed like ink across the faded fabric, eyes locked on the constellations. Neither spoke for a while. The silence was good, whole, honest. "I used to think the stars were lonely," she said at last. "All that distance, all that space between them." Caleb glanced at her, then back to the sky. Or maybe they're just comfortable being where they are. She turned her head, watched him in the faint starlight. "Do you ever wish for more?" He didn't answer right away, just exhaled slowly, like the question deserved space. "Not more," he said, "just real." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Caleb pointed at the sky. "I've seen people chase more their whole lives. Bigger houses, faster cars, fancier vacations, doesn't fill the empty spots, but something real, someone who looks you in the eye and means what they say. A job that leaves you tired but proud. A quiet night like this with nothing to prove. He turned his gaze back to her. "That's the kind of stuff that sticks." Lena's chest ached in a way that wasn't painful. It was just awake, like something dormant had stirred for the first time in years. She looked up again. The stars didn't feel so lonely now. Next to him, under that quiet sky, she didn't either. The city never slept, but inside Sinclair Automotive's gleaming glass tower, tension was wide awake and sharpening its claws. The boardroom, sleek and soulless, buzzed with the low thrum of hushed voices and vibrating phones. Leather chairs were filled with men and women in tailored suits, their expressions tight, their eyes darting to the head of the table, empty now for weeks. Malene Sinclair's absence had gone from curious to costly. Spreadsheets bled red across projection screens. The upcoming model launch had stalled. Partnerships were faltering. Stock had dipped. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to make the sharks circle. Enough to embolden whispers into headlines. Where is Malene Sinclair? Billionaire CEO vanishes, company in crisis, Sinclair empire on the brink? In her chair now sat Thomas Greer, interim acting executive and board member since the early days. Sharp suits, sharper grin. He'd always waited in the wings, and now he leaned forward, knuckles tapping the table like a man taking slow bites out of a once indigestible meal. "She's not coming back," he said flatly. "We all know it. What we need now is stability. Investors need confidence, not ghost stories." "But the press release said she's on extended leave," someone murmured. Thomas smiled. "Extended leave doesn't mean she's coming back. It just means we haven't declared her irrelevant yet." In the corners of the room, heads nodded. Unspoken agreements began forming like cracks under pressure. Meanwhile, social media churned with speculation. Photos of Lena from speaking events were reposted with dramatic filters. Some said she'd had a breakdown. Others claimed she'd fled to Europe, or rehab, or worse. No one guessed she was sitting on a garage rooftop in a small town, watching stars and drinking soda from a dusty bottle. The Sinclair name was still powerful, but power built on mystery had a short shelf life. Her absence was no longer intriguing. It was becoming inconvenient. And somewhere across town, in a rival skyscraper with gold trim and ambition leaking from every floor, another CEO smiled as he prepared a hostile proposal, seeing not a woman in hiding, but a company on its knees. The empire was wobbling, and without knowing it, Lena was about to become the storm she had once outrun. The garage was quieter than usual that morning, the lull between appointments stretching longer than expected. Caleb sat on a low stool, oil-streaked hands working through the guts of a stubborn carburetor. Lena stood a few feet away, watching him with a look that had become more familiar lately, something between admiration and deep thought. She hadn't said much all morning, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd been building up to it. When she finally spoke, it was soft, careful. "I want to help." Caleb glanced up, brow furrowed. "You already do. You've made the coffee drinkable." "I'm serious." She stepped closer, pulling a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket. "I ran some numbers last night. This place has potential, real potential. You could add 2 more bays, upgrade your tools, hire another tech, maybe even start training young people like Emily's classmates. It could grow." He took the paper but didn't look at it. "I want to invest," she said, voice firmer now. "Not out of pity, not to take over, just because it matters. You matter. This place matters." For a long moment, Caleb didn't say a word. The only sound was the faint ticking of the shop clock and the chirp of a bird outside the open door. He finally set down the carburetor and wiped his hands slowly on a rag. "I appreciate it," he said, looking at her squarely, "but no." Lena blinked. "No?" He nodded. "I don't want a check, Lena. I don't want to trade your name for mine." She opened her mouth, but he cut her off gently. "If we're building something, whatever this is, let's build it together. Not with a signature, with sweat, with real work, with busted knuckles and late nights. That's how things last." Her hands tightened around the folded paper. Then slowly, she let out a breath and nodded. "Okay," she said, voice steady. "Together." Caleb smiled. "That's the only way I know how." And in that moment, Lena felt something shift. She'd built empires before, but this was the first time she felt like she might be building a life. It started with a shadow, long and quick, slicing across the cracked sidewalk outside Millie's diner. Caleb looked up from the hood of a Ford with a bad alternator and squinted toward the sky. The sound followed a second later. Not the usual hum of crop dusters or traffic from the state highway. This was heavier, sharper. Rotors. The kind that didn't belong in Maplewood. By the time he stepped out from the garage, the chopper was already descending, sleek, black, and branded with no insignia, just power painted into every curve. It kicked up dust and leaves as it landed on the old soccer field behind the high school, the goalposts shaking in protest. Within minutes, townfolks gathered on the sidewalks, phones raised, brows furrowed. Whispers started as soon as the first man stepped out in a black suit and sunglasses. 2 more followed. Then came the cameras, flash bulbs, voices calling out names, some right, most wrong. Caleb turned just in time to see Lena standing in the garage doorway. Her face had gone pale, not from fear exactly, but something worse. Recognition. The kind that settles in your bones when your past comes roaring back before you're ready to meet it. "Lena," he said, stepping toward her. She didn't move. A voice cut through the crowd from behind a camera lens. "Malene, over here. Is it true you resigned? Are you launching a private venture?" Another shouted, "Where have you been? Is this where you've been hiding?" Lena backed up a step instinctively, her shoulder brushing against the frame of the garage. Her breath hitched. The blanket of peace she'd carefully wrapped around herself in this town, the diner booths, the grease under her nails, the stargazing nights, was unraveling stitch by stitch. Caleb reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to him, eyes wide and damp, and whispered, "I'm not ready." He didn't ask what she meant, didn't tell her it would be okay. He just held her hand tighter and stepped in front of her. Because sometimes protection isn't in fighting back. It's in standing still with someone when the world comes looking. And that's exactly what he did. The storm of cameras didn't last long. Maplewood didn't have enough mystery to keep the press entertained for more than a day. But the damage was done. The quiet Lena had found, the fragile anonymity, was gone. Every pair of eyes in town now carried recognition, curiosity, and questions that hadn't existed a week ago. She tried to stay. For one more night, she curled up on the break-room couch, listening to the creaks in the garage roof and the familiar hum of Caleb's radio playing some old blues station. But the next morning, she packed her bag. Caleb didn't stop her. He didn't beg or make a speech. That wasn't his way. He simply made coffee like always and handed her a travel mug when she came out wearing the same flannel she'd borrowed days ago. "You heading back to the world?" he asked gently. She nodded. For now. There were a dozen things she wanted to say. A dozen more she wasn't sure how to voice. But instead of trying to force the right words, she slipped a small, folded paper into his hand. "Don't open it yet," she said. "Not until I'm gone." He looked at her, his hand curling around the paper like it might burn if he let go. "Is this goodbye?" he asked quietly. She smiled, small, tired, real. "No, just a pause." She stepped outside, the early morning sun catching the last of the dew on her windshield. As she opened the car door, Caleb stood at the edge of the garage, watching but not chasing. That was what she loved most. He never tried to keep her. He just made staying feel like something she wanted. The engine hummed to life. She gave him a final look, then drove off, the dust from the road rising behind her like a soft wave. Only after the sound faded did Caleb unfold the paper. It wasn't a check, not blueprints, just a hand-sketched drawing in pencil, a simple building, a sign above it that read, "Reed and Sinclair, Mechanic School and Workshop," and below it 2 names written side by side. Not business partners, just builders of something that mattered. The days that followed were quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles into your bones like a warm evening, but the hollow sort, the kind that echoes, the kind that makes every dropped wrench sound like it matters more than it does. Caleb kept the garage running, just like always. Oil changes, brake pads, the occasional flat tire. But something was missing, and it wasn't a part he could replace or order in from the warehouse. Lena's mug still sat on the shelf above the break-room sink, the one with the chipped handle she always reached for first. He hadn't moved it, couldn't bring himself to. He told himself it was silly, but there it stayed, waiting, like the blanket still folded on the couch, like the drawing now pinned on the corkboard where he usually kept invoices. Customers asked less about her now. The initial buzz had faded, and the people of Maplewood, for all their curiosity, knew when to stop poking. They'd moved on, mostly, but Caleb hadn't. Each morning he walked past the bench in Lincoln Park and glanced at it longer than necessary. Each evening he climbed the ladder to the roof and watched the stars like he used to, waiting for a familiar voice to ask him if he still wanted something more. But the days turned into weeks. No calls, no texts, not even a headline, just silence. Not cruel, not angry, just the kind of silence that settles in when someone leaves without slamming the door. He thought about her hands tightening around a wrench for the first time, about her laughter echoing through the diner, about the way she whispered, "I'm not ready," like it was the most honest thing she'd ever said. He hadn't told anyone, but he kept a slice of bread in the glove box of his truck. Just one, wrapped in a napkin, forgotten by everyone but him. Because sometimes it wasn't about the sandwich. It was about what started with one. The television in Millie's diner was rarely on, except during storms or championship games. But that morning, someone had switched it to the national news. The usual voices buzzed through the chatter of breakfast orders and coffee refills, barely noticed, until a single name silenced the room. Maline Sinclair. Caleb, seated at the counter with his hands wrapped around a mug, didn't flinch. He just stared ahead, steam rising into his face, steady as ever. The anchor's voice filled the space like a sudden draft, After weeks of speculation surrounding her disappearance, Sinclair Automotive CEO Malene Sinclair broke her silence today in a live interview that aired moments ago. What she shared surprised everyone. The screen cut to her, hair pulled back in a loose bun, no stylist curls, no carefully tailored suit, just a soft blue sweater and eyes that didn't sparkle with calculation, but something gentler, something true. She sat across from the host, cameras trained on her face, but she didn't flinch. She didn't perform. When I left, she said, I wasn't running from responsibility. I was running from losing myself. Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to just be. I forgot how to sit in silence, how to breathe without being watched. I forgot what it meant to matter as a person, not a title. The host leaned forward. And what changed? Lena smiled softly, the kind of smile Caleb had seen in person, the real one. A man offered me half a sandwich. The studio audience laughed gently, unsure if it was a joke, but Lena didn't laugh. Her voice quieted, grew steadier. He didn't know who I was, didn't ask. He just saw someone who looked cold and hungry and gave what he had. No strings, no expectations, just kindness. She paused, looking down briefly. That moment reminded me who I used to be, who I want to be again. Back at the diner, no one said a word. The waitress stopped mid-pour. Someone put down their fork and just stared at the screen. Caleb didn't smile, didn't move. He just whispered under his breath, "Welcome back, Lena." The morning air had turned crisp, the kind that smelled like leaves and wood smoke and the promise of change. Maplewood was shifting into fall, and the trees lining Main Street had begun to blush gold and red. Caleb stood outside the garage, wiping down the windshield of a truck with a cloth that had seen better days. He liked mornings like this, quiet, cool, uncomplicated. Then he heard it, the sound of boots on gravel, steady, unhurried, familiar. He didn't turn right away. Maybe he didn't want to break the moment too soon. Maybe part of him was afraid it wasn't real. But then he heard her voice. "You said you wanted to build something?" He turned. There she was. Not in heels, not in a crisp blazer, not in the ghost of the woman who had vanished weeks ago. She wore jeans, a faded flannel, and a pair of worn-in work boots dusted with road salt. In one hand she held 2 paper cups. In the other, a folded blueprint tube tucked under her arm. Her hair was wind-swept, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her smile, her real one, was already stealing the breath from his lungs. "Thought I'd bring the coffee this time," she said, holding one out to him. He took it, fingers brushing hers, but said nothing. Just stared. She shifted her weight, suddenly unsure. "I didn't come to fix everything. I'm not here to buy you out or change your life. I'm just here, if that's still okay." Caleb set the coffee on the hood of the truck and stepped forward slowly. "It's more than okay." She exhaled, the kind of breath a person holds for far too long. "I missed this place," she said softly. "Missed me in it." He reached out, brushed a leaf from her shoulder, like it had been waiting there just for him to notice. "You're right on time." They stood like that for a beat, the sun catching the edge of the red garage door, the world around them just beginning to wake up. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel so far away. They didn't start with a plan. Just a broom, 2 pairs of gloves, and the unspoken understanding that something old was ready to become something new. The garage had stood for decades, worn by time and weather and the weight of 1,000 repairs. But now it pulsed with quiet purpose, like it had been waiting for this. Lena showed up each morning before the sun finished rising, hair tied back, flannel sleeves rolled, and that same pair of boots caked a little more in dust each day. She didn't come to oversee. She came to work, and she proved it with every splinter she pulled, every pane of glass she cleaned until it gleamed like memory. Caleb handled the guts of the place, machines, tools, lifts. He replaced the old air compressor, rewired the ancient breaker box, and carved out a new workspace by knocking down the warped plywood wall that had sagged since before he inherited the shop. His hands stayed stained with grease, but his smile, more frequent now, carried less weight. They didn't talk about the company, or the headlines, or what came after. They talked about where to hang the new tools, about how many coats of paint the front wall would need, about what color Emily thought the trim should be. Speaking of Emily, she took it upon herself to be the shop's creative director. Armed with markers, poster board, and unwavering confidence, she crafted signs that read, "Mechanics welcome, no lying allowed. Fixing cars, fixing hearts." And her favorite, taped proudly above the doorway in shaky handwriting, "Home of the honest mechanic." Lena teared up when she saw that one. She sanded the window frames by hand, humming under her breath. Caleb caught her once, streaked with paint, dancing barefoot on the drop cloth to a song playing from the old radio. She didn't know he was watching. He didn't interrupt. They weren't building an empire, they were building a place, where honesty had a front door, where work had meaning, where names didn't matter, but the people behind them did. And for the first time, the garage didn't just smell like oil. It smelled like beginning. The folding chairs in the Maplewood town hall squeaked like always, no matter how slowly people tried to sit down. The overhead lights buzzed with that familiar flicker, casting a pale glow over wood-paneled walls, and a dusty podium that hadn't been replaced since the Reagan administration. Town meetings weren't fancy, but they were sacred. A place where gossip met decisions and opinions ran louder than the microphone. That night, every seat was filled, not because of a zoning issue or the bake sale committee. Those could barely pull a dozen folks. No, tonight, people came for one reason. She showed up. Lena. Not the woman from the headlines, not the name scrawled across finance articles and business blogs, just Lena. In a plaid shirt and jeans, hair pulled back, a notebook clutched under her arm like maybe she had something to say, or maybe she just wanted to listen. The room quieted when she stepped in, followed by a flicker of murmurs that spread like wind across wheat fields. That's her, right? She's the one from the news? Thought she'd be taller. Weren't she hiding from a lawsuit or something? No, she's building something with Caleb now. Building what? I don't know. A garage? A life? She heard them all, every whisper, every sideways glance. But she kept walking. Caleb was already there, leaning against the back wall in his usual spot, arms crossed, expression unreadable but steady. When she reached him, he straightened, gave her a small nod, and then did something that made the entire room hold its breath. He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said in a voice that carried through the silence, "She's one of us now." No more, no less. The room didn't erupt. No applause, no debate, just a ripple of something unseen, a recognition, a shift. And slowly, the weight of every stare began to lift. Lena exhaled, her fingers relaxing around the spine of her notebook. She didn't need to speak that night. Caleb had said everything that mattered, and for the first time she felt less like someone returning and more like someone who had finally arrived. It started with a piece of ham on the floor. Caleb stepped on it by accident, slipping slightly before catching himself against the workbench. He looked down, then up, and spotted Emily standing nearby with a butter knife in one hand and mayonnaise on her cheek like war paint. "Emily, he said slowly, "why is there lunch on the floor of my garage?" She blinked innocently. "I was testing the menu." Lena, sitting cross-legged on an overturned crate, laughed into her coffee. "Testing the menu?" Emily nodded, wiping her fingers on her shirt like a true artist. "I'm designing the sandwich cafe." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What sandwich cafe?" Emily pointed to the wall behind her, where she had already taped up a sign in thick rainbow marker. "Garage grub, fixing cars and hunger." Lena tilted her head, pretending to examine it with deep seriousness. "I like it. Bold branding. Excellent use of exclamation points." Emily beamed. "It'll be a little counter, just inside the front. Only sandwiches. Only good ones." Caleb crouched down. "Why sandwiches?" Emily shrugged, brushing a crumb from her elbow. "Because sandwiches made everything better. If you hadn't shared one, she never would have come here, and you wouldn't smile so much now. So sandwiches fix stuff too." Neither adult spoke for a moment. Then Emily added in that matter-of-fact way only kids can, "And if someone's hungry, they should always be able to get one. No money needed, no one should ever be hungry again." Lena reached out, tucking a flyaway strand behind Emily's ear. "That's a beautiful reason." Caleb looked at the ham on the floor, the glittery sign, and the girl who had somehow always known more than her years allowed. "Guess we better clear out the space near the front desk," he said finally. "Looks like we've got a new business partner." Emily's face lit up. "Can I name the sandwiches?" Lena smiled. "Only if you name one after the guy who gave you your first." Emily grinned and wrote it down on her notepad with dramatic flair. "The Caleb Classic, PB&J, with a whole lot of heart." The garage was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after midnight. The air carried the scent of worn rubber, warm metal, and coffee that had been sitting on the hot plate too long. The overhead light above the open hood of a '98 Chevy buzzed faintly, casting a golden pool that made everything beneath it look softer, slower. Lena wiped her hands on a rag, leaving dark streaks across her palms and wrists. Grease smudged her cheek, and a loose strand of hair stuck to the side of her neck, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She was too focused on the engine, listening to Caleb explain something about the timing belt, while music drifted from the old radio in the corner, a slow, crackly tune that sounded like it belonged to a memory. Caleb stood beside her, his voice low and easy, but his hands had stilled. He was watching her now, the way she leaned in, the way she listened, like it all mattered, like he mattered. She turned, holding a wrench loosely in one hand. "So this is what contentment feels like," she said, half laughing. Caleb didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, the flannel sleeves rolled up, the shadows under her eyes softer now, the faint sparkle in her expression when she caught him watching. She wasn't a headline tonight, not a company or a last name or a symbol of anything. She was just Lena, tired, real, and here. He reached up and brushed his thumb across her cheek, wiping away the smudge without a word. She didn't flinch, didn't pull back. She only looked at him with a steadiness that made his breath catch. "I'm not good at big moments," he said quietly. "Never had the timing for them." Lena tilted her head. "Then don't make it big. Just make it true." So he did. Under the hood light, with grease on both their hands and the radio playing something soft and slow, Caleb leaned in and kissed her. Gently, like he'd been waiting not for the right time, but the right truth. And she kissed him back, because nothing had ever felt more honest. The email arrived just past dawn, glowing on the screen of the motel room laptop Lena hadn't touched in weeks. The subject line was clean, clinical. Board decision, immediate action required. She read it 3 times before the weight of it settled in her chest. They wanted her back, but not just as CEO, as chairwoman. Global lead on the merger she'd helped draft a year ago, but abandoned when she walked away. Her absence had created a vacuum, one the board had filled with contingency plans and ambition. Now they were dangling it all in front of her again, total control. More influence. A chance to rebuild her legacy on an even grander scale. All she had to do was return, full-time. No distractions, no detours, no Maplewood. Lena sat on the edge of the motel bed, the email still open, her reflection faint in the dark screen. It felt like a mirror of who she used to be, sharp, polished, untouchable. Everything she'd worked for was right there in front of her, all of it. Except now she knew what it had cost. She remembered how lonely it felt to sit in those meetings, her name spoken like a brand instead of a person. She remembered the numbness that came after applause, the silence that echoed through her penthouse louder than any boardroom debate. And she remembered Caleb. The grease under his nails, the softness in his eyes when she talked about fear instead of profit, the kiss under the hoodlight that didn't care about who she was on paper, only who she'd become standing beside him in work boots. She scrolled through the email again, this time noticing the fine print. The subtle clause tucked near the end. All executive decisions must reflect undivided commitment to corporate image and leadership representation. Translation: no more garage, no more diner, no more Caleb. It was everything she'd ever wanted, and suddenly it didn't feel like hers at all. She closed the laptop. And for the first time in her life, she chose to pause instead of climb. The letter didn't come easily. It wasn't typed on thick, embossed paper with a corporate seal at the top. It wasn't drafted by a legal team or passed through PR for polish. It was handwritten, pen to paper, raw and imperfect, on a yellow notepad from the corner of the break room, coffee stains in the margin, Caleb's spare wrench resting beside it for no reason other than it felt grounding. Lena sat at the workbench, the garage still and quiet around her. Outside, the sun rose over Maplewood like it always did, soft, slow, unaware that anything significant was about to happen. She tapped the pen against the table, then leaned forward and wrote the first word. To the board. She paused, then the rest came like a slow exhale. I know you were expecting a resignation, or perhaps a retreat. What I'm offering instead is something else entirely. Clarity. For years, I led this company with precision, with sacrifice, and with fire. I did what was expected, what was strategic, and what made headlines. I believed that power came from never slowing down, never admitting uncertainty, and never asking for help. But I was wrong. Power without peace is a prison. I'm not stepping down. I'm stepping into who I really am. I will continue to advise and lead, but on my terms. I will no longer sacrifice my identity for an image, nor trade authenticity for appearances. If you want a puppet, you'll need to find someone else. If you want the woman who built this company from nothing, she's still here. She just wears boots now, and sometimes she smells like motor oil and peanut butter sandwiches. Let the record show. Malene Sinclair is not lost. She's found. She signed it. No title, no flourish, just her name, the full one. And when she slipped it into the envelope, sealed it with a small grease-smudged thumbprint, and dropped it into the outgoing mail pile beside Caleb's tax forms and a note from Emily's school, she smiled. Because this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The whole town showed up, even the ones who never liked crowds. Millie closed the diner early. The mayor brought folding chairs, even though no one really planned to sit. Kids chased each other across the gravel lot, and someone from the fire department set up a hot chocolate stand near the garage's front door. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, the kind of weather that made things feel ceremonial, even if the ceremony was small-town simple. Caleb stood beside Lena, both of them in matching flannels and worn jeans, a thin red ribbon stretched across the front of the garage doors. Emily bounced on her toes next to them, holding a pair of oversized scissors that looked like they belonged to a comic book villain, not a second grader. Lena held the sign under a canvas tarp, heart thudding quietly in her chest. She had given speeches in rooms filled with thousands, but today her hands shook more than they ever had behind a podium. This wasn't about earnings. This wasn't about strategy. This was about belonging. Caleb looked at her, his hand brushing hers, grounding her the way he always did. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. Emily, on cue, raised the scissors high and announced, "Okay, everyone, on the count of 3. They counted together, voices layered with excitement and disbelief that this was actually happening, that a billionaire and a mechanic had somehow become something more than a headline or a rumor. 1, 2, 3. Lena pulled the tarp away, and the sign gleamed in the late morning sun. Reed and Sinclair, Auto and Deli, built with trust, served with kindness. Underneath, hand-painted and proudly imperfect, was a sandwich, peanut butter, jelly, and a little heart carved into the crust. Emily had drawn it herself, and no one had dared suggest anything else. Applause broke out, loud and warm, echoing down Main Street. Caleb smiled. Lena laughed, a laugh that reached her eyes. For a moment, everything slowed, the crowd, the chatter, even the wind. They didn't build an empire. They built a place people could walk into and feel seen, and that was more than enough. The journalist didn't come with a camera crew or an agenda. He came with a flat tire and a sour look, muttering about how his GPS had taken him off the main highway and into the middle of whatever this town is. Caleb waved him into Bay 2 without fuss and went to work like it was just another Tuesday. Lena was behind the sandwich counter, yes, the sandwich counter, wearing an apron that said PB&J Queen in Emily's handwriting. She offered the man coffee while he waited. He grunted a half thank you, barely looking up from his phone. It wasn't until he asked to use the bathroom and spotted the framed drawing above the break room door, the one with the original Reed and Sinclair sketch, grease-stained and slightly wrinkled, that his reporter instincts kicked in. "That's not—" "Wait, is this you?" he asked, turning to Lena with a dawning realization. She smiled. "Depends. What did the internet say I look like?" He blinked. "You're her, Malene Sinclair." Caleb, tightening the last lug nut, didn't even pause. "She prefers Lena." The journalist sat down his phone. "And you're not joking? You're just here? Running a garage and making sandwiches?" Lena shrugged. "Well, I do a mean grilled cheese, too. But yeah." The man looked around at the hand-painted sign, the happy kid in the corner coloring on a toolbox, the grease on Lena's fingertips. He asked if he could write about it. Just a small piece. Just the story. She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at her. "Why not?" she said. 2 days later, it was everywhere. She was a billionaire, he was a mechanic. They built something better. The article was simple, no flashy headlines, no scandal, just a story about a woman who walked away from everything and a man who offered her half a sandwich and a place to be real. It spoke of kindness, of second chances, of what it meant to choose enough instead of more. The internet devoured it, not because it was glamorous, because it was true. And in the quiet corner of a garage in Maplewood, Caleb and Lena didn't change. But everything around them did. The years rolled on, the way time does in places that feel like home, slow enough to savor, fast enough to make you blink and wonder where it all went. The garage thrived, not just as a repair shop, but as a gathering place. Locals came for oil changes and stayed for Emily's evolving sandwich menu. High school kids interned during the summers. Families dropped off their cars and sat at the small cafe counter while they waited, sipping coffee and trading stories. Reed and Sinclair had become more than a business. It had become part of the town's rhythm, stitched into the fabric of Maplewood like it had always been there. One fall afternoon, the leaves just starting to flame red at the edges, Lena sat at the picnic table outside the garage, the sun warm against her shoulders. A group of kids from the local school field trip giggled around her, crumbs from peanut butter sandwiches littering the table like confetti. A little girl with braids and chocolate on her cheek climbed onto the bench beside her, chewing thoughtfully. "Miss Lena?" she asked. Lena looked down, brushing crumbs from the girl's sleeve. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Why do you always cut your sandwich in half?" the girl asked. "My mom says you always do that, even when it's just for you." Lena smiled, soft and far away. She looked down at the sandwich in front of her, clean diagonal cut, crusts on, just the way Caleb used to make them. "Well," she said slowly, "a long time ago when I was really lost, someone saw me sitting on a park bench. I didn't know him. He didn't know me. But he looked at me like I was still a person, and he gave me half his sandwich." The little girl's eyes widened. "Did it taste good?" Lena chuckled. "It tasted like home, like being seen, like a second chance." She leaned down, whispering like it was a secret. "That half sandwich gave me my whole life back." The girl blinked, then nodded, like it made perfect sense. And across the lot, Caleb stepped out from the garage, wiping his hands on an old rag, watching her the way he always had, with quiet love and full knowing. Some stories don't need big endings, just one small moment shared and a sandwich that changed everything.